Emily,
stock.
how you doing?
Just fine.
Grady,
How are
huh?
you?
Good to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. Thanks for having me. Hi there, Emily Stock. Well, don't do this too often.
And they caught themselves in
Because we've had some major injuries in Virginia.
yeah, yeah. So be careful when you back up. There's not a whole lot of room there. So your drive time ended up being a whole lot different towards the end than Mhm. Well, we know the old ones won't like that. I won't interrupt you. Here, is he going to leave that? Okay. Because I was going to just put my papers. No, no, I'll stand up. I was going to just put my papers where he's got his computer, but yeah, yeah. That's what I was going to ask him to click in. Because I'm probably going to put my paper in. Forward and go back. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hey, while we put our papers where you've got your computer here, is there a way to, can you put your computer down here? No?
Well, if I close it, it's gonna go to
No,
sleep.
no, you don't have to close it. Just set it to the side there.
Uh,
Can you do that?
Let me see if I can.
If the mouse pad isn't active and you're scrolling, just put the paper on the mouse pad and it'll be okay.
Well, I'm just thinking about the fact I have all these things connected to
Okay,
it.
okay.
I might be able to get. You're just gonna put your papers down
Yeah.
because I could just put like a little piece of tape to tack it so it wouldn't slide off.
We should have some power.
It's gotta.
Let me see if I can push this over.
Give you some more room.
Yeah, this should be fine.
Okay.
Good afternoon. If you want to, just find a seat, or you're more than welcome to stand. If you've been like me, sitting most of the morning, it's a good break to stand. I'm Grady Hunt. I'm the Division 6 member of the Board of Transportation, and again, welcome. Today's session, Planning Beyond Boundaries, will allow us to discuss how we better develop and plan transportation systems by collaborating across boundaries. If you are like me in the southeastern part of the state and had what they said was 500-year storms within 2 years, you appreciate all the collaboration from outside of your boundary, whether it was for us FEMA, whether it was the National Guard, whether it was the state of North Carolina, the Department of Transportation. Without those outside agencies in my home county of Robeson County, it would have been a very difficult and unmanageable time without outside influences. So this is important to know that we're planning beyond our own boundaries, because none of us can do it all on our own. So that's really important, and I appreciate you being here. If you've not already done so, please take a moment and download the Crowd Compass Attendee Hub app in the App Store. Once in the app, search for Transportation Summit and download the event. The app will allow you to up-to-the-minute agenda over the next 2 days, as well as allow you to network with other attendees and participate in the interactive game. We've got one of our board members that is keeping up with all of us to see in the game section who has the most points, and I guess you can click on it and it'll tell you how many points you have and who's leading the race, I guess. But if you will go to the app, if you'll go to schedule and our breakout sessions there, just click on the breakout session, and right now there's 8 folks that's checked in, and that gives you all the speakers and the survey. So if you go to the app, you can go to the survey. You can also participate through social media by using the hashtag NCTranspo2020. Now, let's welcome our distinguished panelists, Trish Hendren, Emily Stock, and Robert Hiett. Trish Hendren is the Executive Director of the I-95 Corridor Coalition, a multi-state, multimodal organization dedicated to improving transportation from Maine to Florida. Trish says she's based out of Washington, D.C. Trish holds a Ph.D. in Transportation Technology and Policy and a master's degree in Ag Econ, both from UC Davis, and a BA in English from Duke University. So welcome, Trish. Next we have Emily Stock, who is the manager of rail planning for the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation. That department is responsible for providing funding and oversight to public transit systems and passenger and freight rail programs across the Commonwealth of Virginia. In her role as manager of rail planning, she leads feasibility planning and environmental studies for rail-related projects and improvements in Virginia. Emily has a master's in urban and environmental planning from the University of Virginia and a bachelor's of science in geology from James Madison University. Welcome, Emily. Finally, Robert Hiett is the director of the Upper Coastal Plain Council of Governments. The UCP COG, as it's known, administers aging services, economic development, planning, and workforce development programs. Robert has 20 years of experience working with rural and urban transportation programs. He served 6 years as the president of the Georgia Transit Association, more than 10 years as its legislative committee chairman, and he's a member of the GTA Hall of Fame. Welcome, Robert. Thank you all for being here today. We can all learn from your collective successes and failures from yourselves as leaders in the region's most high-profile cross-boundary projects. We'll start with you, Robert, to give the audience a regional perspective.
Thanks. Yeah, we're all navigating the stage up here. Good afternoon. It's always interesting to be the right after lunch speaker, so I'll try to make it as informative and entertaining as I can, and look forward to y'all's questions after all the speakers are done. All right, so we're all in various parts of transportation. We know that transportation is a very important part of how we're going to grow, develop today and in the future, and we know how long some of these projects take to actually go from a good idea to actually happening out in the day-to-day world. And we all go through planning processes where we're all working hard. We're trying to come up with our projects, get them prioritized, match them for funding, and get that critical stakeholder input. And I really think the name of the game of today's session really is these partnerships. The partnerships that go on in transportation, the partnerships that need to occur outside of transportation, other people we need to work with to be successful. Obviously, a lot of roads, major things, they don't stop at a city or county line. We have to work multi-jurisdictionally. And then big projects require lots of counties or multiple regions to work together. Sometimes those can happen relatively quick, and other times they can take quite a while, as y'all all know. Anytime we're talking about critical transportation projects, infrastructure, transit service delivery, or other things, we've always got opportunities that we can take or opportunities that could be missed. I don't know that it would be a transportation presentation if I didn't have a road sign and a road in here. But basically, when we're looking at these different partnerships, working across boundaries, it's not just MPOs, RPOs, city or county governments. There's a lot of people that we have to work with to be successful. And so sometimes boundaries are what we know as our planning boundaries, but other times they're what we think of as program silos. People that could be a stakeholder, maybe even a good one, but they just may not understand or be involved with the transportation planning process. And so as much as we try to put information out there, I think part of the discussion and building partnerships is making sure that we're going out there to talk with them, meet them on their turf, and talk about why transportation matters to them. When we look at transportation across North Carolina, just in our own sphere, we've got a lot of organizations, a lot of groups, a lot of people in the mix, many of you out here in the audience. And again, the name of the game is develop the projects, get them funded, prioritized, and get them built. And that takes a lot of work. But when we're working across these boundaries, well, these things change. Over the next census, they're going to change again. And so we always have to be mindful that things aren't static in this field, and plans and things that we put in place 10 years ago. I think you've got speakers today, speakers tomorrow. Technology, conditions on the ground, lots of different things change these. And so, again, we've got a very good, strong system working within the transportation sector to talk about these. But there's always opportunities to reach out and talk with others. I think in the intro you were talking about some of the different partners that we had to work with on emergency response and disaster recovery. On the transit service side, you know, we've got a lot of changing demographics in the state. We're getting a lot of younger folks. We're all aging to some extent. We've got a good, strong transit network in the state, good local county systems. Some are multi-county, and we've got different things that go on that try to ensure that they're all connected. Again, that's another area where the work is never done. There's always a new stakeholder that can be brought to the table, always a new perspective, because transit service, as you all well know, is constantly evolving. And right now with microtransit, with technology, with a lot of public and private sector players in the discussion, there's a lot of things that what we knew about transportation just a few years ago, you know, it's all changing. So understanding kind of what's going on in that area, how those changes impact our service delivery, how they impact our road design, our road network, and current and future needs. All of these things are important to us. I could have a lot of slides up here about different regions and different boundaries, but I'm time limited, so I picked one. And in this example, when we're looking at transportation systems, whether it's road, transit, or other, you know, we're looking at trying to make the system efficient, get the improvements in. We're looking at safety considerations, but we're also looking at things from an economic development standpoint. Where's the growth coming? Where's the growth likely to expand, and how does the transportation network need to evolve? And so when we're looking at things like our transit service delivery in our rural areas, and we just keep in mind the boundary, the RPO, MPO boundaries that we looked at a minute ago, and when it comes to workforce and economic development, you've got a whole nother set of boundaries. And so some of those fall in one RPO or MPO, and others cross multiple boundaries. There's things that are going on there, and on top of that, you have 23 workforce boards. They have different boundaries. But their mission is to train our citizens for jobs, to meet our employer needs, and help to grow our economy too. And they're very dependent on the transportation network and the services that comes out of our planning and prioritization. And so certainly a continued area where we can continue to have dialogue is, you know, looking at our local and our regional mobility concerns. You know, particularly in rural areas, the job training doesn't stop at the county line. For our seniors, our medical services need to cross county lines. And so we certainly want to look at things from their perspective, so we can understand how can we make workforce and economic development a stronger partner with our transit services and our transit service delivery. And when we understand their concerns, you know, we're able to incorporate that in our process, and maybe more people get transported, and maybe more people get trained for jobs. Maybe that helps our economy, and so on and so forth. So, you know, for the most part, warned me on my time back there. So really, for the most part, is the name of the game is keep doing what we're doing in the transportation sector, but just remember that there's a lot of stakeholders that make us important. We need to be reaching out to them. We want them to be part of our planning and prioritization process, but when we're done with that, we need to make sure that we're involved with them and explaining why that transportation matters. Really quick, our national associations, I represent us on a couple of national transportation associations as well, and our associations are there to help with our professional development advocacy issues, really the big lift stuff that we all have in common. So they're really important, I guess, cogs in the wheel, so to speak. And we certainly want to make sure we keep them connected and that we're communicating what our needs and priorities are as well. And then lastly, as I said earlier, the state's changing. There's lots of new folks moving here. Our economy's growing. Our transportation system is going to continue to evolve with it. And so I just encourage y'all, keep looking. Always ask where that next partner is, who could be a partner, and try to talk to them about why transportation is important to them, and win them over to the cause. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. Emily?
Thank you. And again, I am Emily Stock with the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation. I appreciate the introduction earlier, Mr. Hunt, and also for introducing my agency, Virginia Department of Transportation, also known as DRPT. A little plug for the agency. We're a sister agency to VDOT, and we focus on rail and public transportation. We work closely with departments of transportation in other states, including NCDOT, that house their own rail divisions within the DOT, which is more typical. We do serve as the state liaison for the Virginia-North Carolina Compact, Rail Compact, and we also serve in that role as a technical advisor on the Southeast Rail Commission that's newly formed. So we do work across states quite a bit. This is a snapshot of rail in Virginia, just to kind of give you the lay of the land. This is our current Amtrak passenger service throughout the state. And it has been, it needs to be updated. It's a little bit out of date. As of a few months ago, we did add another frequency to Norfolk in 2019. So there should be another blue line on there. But the blue lines are state-sponsored Amtrak routes. And there's also a light blue line there for the North Carolina-sponsored Carolinian route. And orange denotes Amtrak long-distance service. And we've done a lot of work in Virginia just over the past 10 years to advance state-sponsored Amtrak service to really get more people on the train. Both the long distance and state-sponsored service carry over 1.5 million passengers per year in Virginia. And in the last 10 years, we've worked with Amtrak and host railroads to add service to Norfolk, to add service to Lynchburg and then on to Roanoke, and also adding more frequencies to Richmond. But we're not finished. I'm going to talk today a little bit about planning beyond boundaries, of course, and specifically about a recently announced initiative known as Transforming Rail in Virginia. But before I get into all the details of that, I want to do a little bit on background. We can't transform anything without partners. And so the state of North Carolina has been a partner throughout the years, as has FRA, Amtrak, and host railroads. And the graphic up here shows some of the work that we've done with those entities over since the 90s and probably before. I just have the history back to 1991 when this was identified, 1991 and then 1992 when this was identified as a Southeast high-speed rail route. And we've been working with North Carolina and the federal government to do environmental feasibility and planning work, starting in 1999 with a Tier 1 environmental impact statement from Washington down to Charlotte. And then over the years, we've finished up environmental for different legs of this corridor. We finished the most recent environmental impact statement in 2019 for Richmond to Washington, and we are partnering with NCDOT on the Long Bridge environmental impact statement as well at the northern terminus that actually goes across the Potomac River into Washington, D.C. So these are all important links in the chain. So, transforming rail in Virginia. In mid-December, Virginia Governor Northam announced a landmark agreement between CSX and the Commonwealth that creates a pathway to separate freight and passenger operations from DC to Richmond, and it also includes the Long Bridge. This is a landmark for us. Unlike in North Carolina, we do not own any of the rail right-of-way in Virginia, and we have reliability issues both for Amtrak service and for Virginia Railway Express, our commuter service that serves Northern Virginia into DC. And so knowing that we have that problem, we came at things from a multi-pronged approach, trying to make incremental improvements along the existing corridor as much as that we can, and planning for that through these environmental impact statements. But this is really transformative, to be able to own some of the real estate and actually separate out freight from passenger for the first time in Virginia. Will really help with our reliability, will help with capacity. So this creates a pathway, this agreement that Governor Northam announced creates a pathway for making these improvements and getting to separated freight and passenger, and for additional frequencies throughout Virginia, down to North Carolina and to the southeast. And during the year 2020, we'll be working more closely with CSX, with Amtrak, and others to figure out how to implement some of these improvements, construction agreements, and operations agreements. So it's still a work in progress, but very exciting. And I'll talk a little bit more about it. So the new Virginia Long Bridge will have 2 tracks dedicated exclusively to passenger rail, both Amtrak and commuter. Right now it's a 2-track bridge that was built at the turn of the last century, and so we'll be doubling the capacity there. And we also will have, this represents acquisition of more than 350 miles of railroad right-of-way and 225 miles of track, and then 37 miles of new track improvements, including a Franconia Springfield bypass, and that's up in Northern Virginia in VRE territory. So this is hard to read, but you can look on our website, drpt.virginia.org, for all of the details about service related to the deal. But I'll talk a little bit about service first, and then talk about infrastructure and right-of-way acquisition. So this will effectively, eventually double the Amtrak service throughout the corridor in phases. And we'll have nearly hourly service between Richmond and DC, and we'll actually get service, better service to Main Street Station, which will give us that capital-to-capital service that we've been aiming for many years. Because right now our highest ridership station is Staples Mill, which is just north of Main Street Station in Richmond. It doesn't get all of the trains that come through Richmond. In the near term, we're looking at a new round trip to Newport News and a new 3rd frequency to Norfolk. And for VRE, this means a 75% increase in capacity is possible, with 15-minute headways during peak hours. So a little bit about the infrastructure and some of the property that we expect to acquire over the years. Part of that is the S-Line, which was included in the environmental impact statement that we worked on with North Carolina for the Richmond to Raleigh Southeast High-Speed Rail project. And that is an abandoned railroad that's owned by CSX now. Our plan is to put track there again, make it faster, make it capable of carrying more passenger trains in a more efficient manner than they travel today between Raleigh and Richmond. We also are planning to acquire the Buckingham Branch Railroad. It's a short line railroad that's owned by CSX, and that's the purple line that goes out to the west. And that will allow us to look at some east-west connections that we haven't had in Virginia before. We don't have a Piedmont service in Virginia. All of our rail lines, all of our service is going north-south to the northeast corridor. So we're going to be exploring that possibility too. And as part of that, one of our next steps, since we're talking about planning, is to look at the future of rail in Virginia and to kind of unpack the infrastructure and right-of-way information that's part of this deal and figure out in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, what could we expect that goes above and beyond some of the planning level work that we've done so far. So we'll be looking all the way out to New River Valley as well. So this just gives a quick description of Long Bridge, and I'm going to look and see how much time I have left. So I'm still doing okay on time. So I mentioned Long Bridge before. The deal with CSX does include Long Bridge, doubling the capacity, going from 2 tracks to 4 tracks, and also transfer or ownership of that bridge to Virginia. And right now, the bridge is at 98% capacity during peak hours. It carries all of the trains that come across from points south of Virginia, VRE trains, and of course those Virginia-sponsored trains. So it's very important for us to get additional capacity and additional reliability in the corridor. So this is a quick snapshot of the next steps in terms of some of the construction projects that we're anticipating. And so the $3.7 billion deal that I talked about with CSX, the projects that are anticipated as part of that deal are expected to be built out by 2030. But there's a lot more that could come along with this. There's service that we could be exploring in the interim. So this is just one part of it, and this is our preliminary plan for things. And again, a lot of this information is included on our website, and some of it is still evolving as we further negotiate agreements with CSX and with Amtrak. And Amtrak's been a huge partner on this. They have agreed to contribute funding as well. So that is it for me. And one more thing that's going to be that's coming on the horizon that you may see coming about today. Our General Assembly is meeting, and actually that's the reason that our Director, Virginia, of the Virginia Department of Rail and Public Transportation, Jennifer Mitchell, couldn't make it today. She's at the General Assembly today, and we will be talking about having a rail authority in North Carolina in the next year or so. So that's another item on the horizon. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I would encourage you again to check in. We started with 8. We've got 23 now that's checked in. Encourage you again to check in so we can do the survey at the end. Trish?
All right, thank you. So I have to say, or start my comments by confessing that I love coming back to North Carolina. So my dad, my late father, grew up in New Bern. I spent pretty much all my summers in North Carolina, and my parents, my older brother, and I all went to college in North Carolina, which Grady already told you where I went, but I did grow up a UNC, Chapel Hill, pretty much fanatic, know all the fight songs, so it kind of broke my dad's heart when I went to Duke, but we'll move on quickly. So when I was thinking about North Carolina and about my presentation, what came to mind was your license plate. I am a total transportation geek, so this makes sense. But just the motto of First in Flight kind of got me thinking about the Wright brothers. And everyone knows in 1903, Orville and Wilbur went to Kitty Hawk and did the first manned flight. So what you may not know is how they decided who got to go first. They flipped a coin, and Wilbur actually won that flip and then proceeded to crash the plane on his turn. And then also Orville went next, and as you know, he flew for 12 seconds, 120 feet. And so the rest was history, shall we say. So I thought that was a pretty interesting little tidbit that they were able to collaborate on who would go first. And then they were sitting there on the beach. They've done 4 additional flights, and they're thinking, okay, how do we make the next one go really well? As they're sitting there talking, an unfortunate thing happened. A wind came up and crashed the plane. So that day ended up with a little bit shorter than they thought, But I think it just shows you how they work together, a true team, but they also had a key player that many folks may not know who she is. So it's this lady in the fabulous hat. So that's their sister, Kate. And Kate likes to describe her brothers as quite rambunctious. I think the house was littered with their airplane material. But she was also there to run their bicycle business, take care of the home so they could go to Kitty Hawk and have the innovation and success that they did. So you might be wondering, why am I telling this story? So I would say the I-95 Corridor Coalition, we kind of consider ourselves a Kate. So we're that partner for other organizations to bring you together to solve problems and connect for solutions. So for folks who may not know who we are, we got started 25 years ago, and we're the 18 states, and yes, I'm giving DC statehood right there, on the East Coast. And we got formed really to address passenger movement and freight movement and really focus on operational issues. And it's a collection of DOTs, MPOs, transit agencies, tolling authorities, law enforcement. So we go across state boundaries as well as disciplines. And as the line at the end here really says, it's about connecting for solutions. So a lot of issues that we're facing in our field right now, we cannot solve as one agency or even as one state. So that's the reason why we're going strong after 25 years and kind of being the Kate to the East Coast. So again, why we got created? The way I look at this is the East Coast is the economic engine of our country. We have 28 major ports, a third of all vehicle miles traveled, a fifth of all roads. So in essence, if we make this work well, then the whole country will benefit. So the better we can work together will benefit not only our region, but also the rest of the country. So how do we do it? So we bring folks together. I think during the first general session, this was brought up as the importance of relationships. We create forums for networking, for understanding if there's an incident, who you call in your neighboring state. So it's really establishing, kind of breaking that bread before the alarm bell goes. So we make sure we have a way for people to get to know each other. We also invest a lot in tools and access to data in order to give agencies what they need to find those solutions. And finally, I feel like a big role of the coalition is to bring more resources to North Carolina, to bring more resources to the East Coast. I lived in California for several years. I don't want them to get the resources to figure out transportation problems. I want us to, because they're the most complicated environment in which transportation is operating. So we want to make sure we have investments and exploration on the East Coast. So in short, the way I like to look at the coalition, the more challenging the topic, the more we are drawn to it like a moth to the flame. So how we do this, we have an executive board that guides our work. So it's the 18 CEOs of the departments of transportation, and Secretary Trogdon is one of our 4 vice chairs. We focus on 3 areas: operations, freight, and innovations. And I'm going to spend the rest of my comments talking about an example from each of these areas, kind of about why planning beyond boundaries is so critical for all our success. So for operations, talk about severe weather. Grady, you mentioned that before. It is definitely an example where we have to work across state lines. Freight movement is the definition of cross-state movement. So what about truck parking? How do we solve that one? And then an innovation, mileage-based usage fee. That has been brought up a couple times today. So I want to talk about the exploration we're doing there. So on the addressing severe weather evacuations, the way we've been addressing this is through the Highway Operations Group. So I have a lot of roots in North Carolina, but I actually was raised in Maryland, so I have to confess to you guys as well, I'm a Redskins fan. Even today, it's painful. But I remember when we had the Hogs, which was one of the proudest moments of being a Redskins fan. So I kind of like the fact that our operations groups are called Hogs. So besides giving me some nice nostalgia there, they're a group that brings basically all the chiefs to an incident together in one room. And I say chiefs because each part of first responders, law enforcement, TMC, they all have a critical key role to play. But how do they work together? How do we keep people safe, clear the incident? So this group has been meeting for 25 years. We have 5 different groups of them to really focus on finding solutions. So what better example than the 2017 Hurricane Irene? Something we've never seen in this country before. Category 5, we have 6.8 million people that were evacuated safely. So that is a success in many ways, but the southern states said we think we can do better. We have some ways that we can adjust. So what the coalition did is we brought North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, and Florida and Georgia together to basically said what worked, what didn't work. And we focused specifically on Florida's emergency shoulder use. It worked great. It's a very effective strategy for them. Caused a lot of problems at the Florida-Georgia state line. As you can imagine, Georgia had a bunch of police officers standing there saying, get off of the shoulder. So that caused quite a problem. So something as simple as bringing folks together, it was agreed that the emergency shoulder use would stop at the I-10, I-75 interchange in Florida. But that gathering of people, again, it goes back to that networking, breaking the bread before an alarm goes off so you know who to talk to, who were your contacts in the other states. And there's a list of things that we've done since that meeting, but I will point to that last one, a pre-hurricane call. It sounds so simple, but it is so effective to make sure who you reached out to last season is still there. You just gotta know who to call and who to have basically on your cell phone to text to get responses. So that's just an example of why you need to go beyond your kind of agencies and disciplines to work together. So it saves lives, gets those relationships, and unfortunately, as our weather seems to be showing us, we need to be even more prepared for these incidents and events because they're happening more frequently. So turning to freight movement, truck parking is probably one of our most challenging topics to address as the East Coast. If you can see, 5 billion tons of freight are moving up and down our corridor. That's about 40% of the GDP is going through our region. That's a lot of movement. The reason why it matters is folks who are familiar with the freight industry, it is an incredibly time-sensitive field or industry. So you have short time turnarounds, very low profit margins. So looking for parking, paying for parking is not really, is very difficult for the freight industry. In addition, it's safety. So if trucks need to pull over for requirements and there's no spot, we end up forcing them to park in a place that is not safe for them, for law enforcement, and for the other users of the roads. So it really does matter. So kind of going through some of the challenges, we have more demand than capacity. It's a lot of NIMBY, people don't want this. It's a private sector issue or a public sector issue. So majority of our truck parking spaces in our country are provided by the private sector. But when there's an issue with truck parking, it becomes a public agency issue. So what do we do with that dilemma? So the good news is, with the coalition, what we're, again, focused on is bringing folks together to say, okay, how do you solve that problem? There are solutions that exist. I'm usually not a fan of having a chart with, or excuse me, a slide with lots of words, but I put all these up there because these are proven solutions that people are using in the corridor. So we got folks together, we closed the door, and we said, okay, let's really talk about this, what's working. And so we put these results up on our website, sharing with our members to, again, get those solutions implemented elsewhere. The other thing that we do is on that resources part. So we go after grants to explore innovative ideas, to explore technology solutions. And we did this to look at testing a real-time truck parking system, which now Virginia has taken over. And so it does provide information. It is a potential solution. I wouldn't say it is the only solution. But the lessons that we learned through that grant work, I think, is really key for other states that are looking at providing reservation systems. And again, I'll just kind of conclude on the truck parking and freight issue that it really does matter when it comes to, again, weather events, and also this is about lives. I'm sure people know about Jason's Law and that tragic event that led to that legislation. So it is, unfortunately, even though the private sector is providing a lot of the spaces and generating a lot of the demand, it is going to be a public sector responsibility as well. All right, so the third example I wanted to highlight, again, examples how we're working across agencies and disciplines is probably one of our more sensitive areas that we're focused on right now, which is how in the heck are we going to fund transportation in the future? So we all know what the problem is. Our transportation revenues are declining. Our vehicles are more fuel efficient, great for your wallet, not so great for a system that's dependent on that fuel tax in order to maintain, operate, and build it. We also have the fleet that is changing. We have vehicles that are out there on the roads that do not pay any fuel tax at all, and that share is growing. That's a good thing for environmental reasons, but it's not, again, not so good for the roads that they're driving on. And then the other point I think doesn't get enough attention is people have absolutely no idea how little that they pay for the roads, bridges, sidewalks, transit systems, rail systems that they use. So we have a huge knowledge gap that we're facing as well as the problem of funding that we're facing. So again, I'm here to try to give you some good news too. And the good news is that Congress recognized this and created a grant program to explore the feasibility of a distance-based fee. So it's a 50-50 match program, 5 years, and the coalition has started going after these to see what the answer could be. And in essence, what we're looking at is if we get rid of the fuel tax, because it's declining anyway, and replace it with a distance-based fee, is that possible technically, politically, public acceptance? Let's figure out what the barriers are and what we can do. Again, why we got involved, why the coalition got engaged. If you look at this map, some great work being done out west. Again, I said I lived in California. I loved it. It's a different state. I live in Maryland right now. I can drive through 3 states in one day. Much more complicated on the East Coast. So we got to make sure that our needs, our unique characteristics are brought into this national discussion that Congress wants us to do. So we started going after grants. We've gone after 3, and we've been successful to do a couple things. 1, out-of-state miles. How do you handle that complicated environment, people traveling across state lines? Tolling. Lots of toll facilities on the East Coast. What does that mean? How can we learn from toll authorities about how they do collection of tolls, cross-state transfers? What does that even mean? So we need to explore our partnership and kind of knowledge sharing there. Trucking, again, a huge focus of the coalition. So far, all of the work on distance-based fee has been in passenger vehicles. And everyone in this room knows that trucks are not big cars. They travel different, they're regulated differently, so we got to focus on them specifically to know what this would look like for them. And finally, I look at amenities. I call this a spoonful of sugar that may or may not make this medicine go down. We drive around in computers. There's all this data in our car, but we don't have access to it. Do we want it? Do we want a Fitbit for our car? Is there something we can give people as we transition that would make them accepting of this new way of funding transportation? All right, so really briefly what we've done, we did a pilot in 2018, small pilot. Every one of these 155 people were invited. These are DEO leads, these are elected officials, these are thought leaders, basically to start the conversation on the East Coast. As you can see, we had 13, or people in 13 states, about 500,000 miles were driven. All right, so what did we learn? Out-of-state miles is an issue. We have data now to kind of go with our gut. About 20% of the miles people drove in that pilot were out of state. And this one I think is actually fascinating. So again, those were selected transportation folks. 65% felt they learned something about transportation funding. So if we as experts or knowledge people in the transportation field are learning, then again, that big gap between the public and the understanding about how transportation is funded. And 31% thought they actually paid more. So again, is that an opportunity? If people think they're paying more, when they find out they're paying less, is that good? How do we have a dialogue there? It is possible to use this technology to collect tolls. So what does that mean? Also, privacy is probably one of the #1 reasons people are very concerned about switching to a distance-based fee. But we're finding when people interact with the technology, understand how it works, their privacy concern drops. I'm a data person. That is an amazing statistical change in 3 months. 57% concern down to 30. So again, what do we do with that? And one thing, people are asking, like, what do people think about, this transition? So of the folks that are engaged in that pilot, again, these are folks that are very knowledgeable about the problem we're facing. 80% thought MBUF might be a good idea. All right, second pilot, I'm getting close to the end here, was to try to bring the voice of the general public in. So we focus mainly in Pennsylvania and Delaware because those are our grant partners, 889 folks for 4 months. So what happened, I put this map up there because I'm still amazed how much people drive. So in those 4 months, people drove across 38 states and into Canada. They drove 3.1 million miles, which is just a lot. So again, if we're going to switch from a fuel tax to a distance-based fee, how do we handle that? How do we understand how people are using the roads, how they should pay for it? So what did we find out? These are some preliminary numbers. I think I have it on the slide somewhere. Oh, it's actually hidden. There's a little asterisk down there at the bottom that says preliminary numbers. So we're still working through these, but I wanted to share what we had right now. A little bit less out-of-state miles than we had in the first pilot, and 72% higher number than the first became more aware about fuel taxes. 61% are like, yeah, if you have MBUF, you probably should also pay tolls. That was higher than we expected. And privacy concerns, again, are dropping. So in this case, it was 49% down to 20. Again, showing that when you interact with technology, with what mileage-based usage fee is, people's concerns drop. And finally, this was higher than I would have guessed, actually, that 67% at the end of the pilot thought they would support MBUF implementation. All right, so the last piece of work that we've done is, again, on motor carriers. We've got to make sure we focus on them, have a unique pilot just for them. So we did a 6-month pilot, again, small to start, to build as we go forward. 55 vehicles. They drove in 27 states, 1.4 million miles. Again, the reason why we're doing this is to ask the motor carriers, what are your unique concerns about this? How would this fit into your heavy regulated environment? All right, so what did we find? I'm going to go over 5 things. 1, we need a lot of education. Oh, my goodness. Again, people don't understand. Let me give an example. We had a phone survey in Delaware and Pennsylvania, and the majority of the people thought transportation revenue was increasing. So, yikes, right? Because as experts in the field, we know that's not the case. But if the public thinks that the funding is fine, and they think the roads are pretty good, then they're not going to see a reason to change. So again, how much do we have a lot of education that's going to be necessary here. The what's in it for me is going to be key. Again, change is hard. I think, again, at that general session, the comment was made, people don't like change. So if we're going to have change, we got to give people a reason to want to do that. I put this quote on here because I was very surprised by this one. So it was one of the participants got his mother to participate because he was concerned about her driving. There is a part of the technology that will tell you, give you a driver score, and he used that information to have a conversation with her to say, you're not such a great driver. I'm not quite sure the former governor would want his wife to have this information. It sounds like there might be some issues there. But again, I bring this up because what about safety? So can this technology help with people's driving habits? So that's a potential that we're going to further look at. And again, these value-added amenities, there's trip logs and driver scores. They can tell you about the health of your engine. We're not getting overwhelmingly positive response yet, but I think I'm not willing to give up on it yet because I just am convinced we have to give people something to want to make this change. So I've recently started drinking beer again. I guess I'm into confessing to you guys. And so when I started looking at this charts, it made me think of a beer. And the point I'm trying to make is the cost of operating a vehicle is the beer. It's the fuel. The state and federal tax is the foam on the top. Nobody knows that. Everyone assumes when the price of their per gallon rate goes up, it's that the states and the feds are taking more money. So again, how do we communicate to folks what the true operating cost of their car is, and that if we switch to a distance-based fee, you're still going to have savings for that Chevy Volt? So again, how do we convey this information that the cost of operating is the fuel, and there's still benefits for different types of vehicles? It's just a lot to communicate. So we tried in our pilot to do that through an invoice, a fake invoice that kind of looks like a utility bill, to again try to educate people about how much fuel they were paying for fuel, taxes, etc. And people seemed to like it. It gave them information they didn't have before, so we're going to keep trying to explore that. My last 2 points are, a gut reaction people have is when we say, the more you use, the more you should pay. Everyone kind of nods their head. So this concept of fairness resonates, but fairness gets much more complicated when you say, well, what about the person living in a rural part of North Carolina that has to drive farther to go to the grocery store? That is not fair. But then you think, well, they're paying more right now because they're using more fuel. So how do we work through this conversation about fairness is going to be not as simple as the more you pay or more you use, the more you pay. And finally, on the motor carrier front, there are systems that we have right now. If you guys want to impress somebody at a cocktail party, you can say, do you know what IFTA is? And you can say, it's the International Fuel Taxation Agreement. And then they'll probably walk away. But you can at least, I don't know, be excited that you know it. So I bring this up because there are some systems we're already using that are like a distance-based fee. So there's opportunity, I think, in the freight sector to move forward faster on this concept. So in closing, kind of bring up those 3 examples of how we need to, again, in order to accomplish what you guys accomplished with that first flight is really working across disciplines and across state lines. So Thank you very much.
Thank you, Trish, Emily, and Robert. Now, let's open the floor for audience participation and questions. I think there's a mic in the back, so if you'll raise your hand, if you have a question, if you'll raise your hand, they'll bring you a mic.
Yes, I appreciate y'all getting this grouping together in this panel, and it was really good that you had a railroad representative. I guess looking at it from the construction and design build facet that we participate in the planning process, the sooner you can get all the stakeholders involved. And I know you give us a incomplete list on the first, but you need the railroads involved, but you also need all the other cross-country users, the utilities, pipeline folks, and that kind of thing. We've got an active design build project that the Atlantic Coast Pipeline is crossing twice. And I don't know that all of those need to be incorporated in those planning and in the early design and permitting phases of that. And so those are stakeholders that sometimes don't get included. They're not in they are in the economics, but they're not sometimes considered. And so I'd just like to hear some comments on that. But like I said, it was good to see the railroads here, because we get to a lot of projects that maybe the railroads haven't been fully considered, or utilities and that kind of thing. And so I'd just like to hear some comments on that.
Is to get from that 30% preliminary engineering level up to 60%, and that gap is going to require quite a bit of cooperation from other utilities. So we've done some of it, but we know we need to do more.
Just to follow up, I was looking more at the first gentleman talking about overall roadway planning and those kind of things, bringing in these other disciplines. I know that North Carolina gentleman, he's looking at me now, and I know that they're heavily involved in certain projects, but all of these need to be make sure they're brought in, know what initiatives the utilities are looking at, what initiatives the rail's looking at, doing in an area that you're planning a roadway or any facility. It crosses all boundaries. Everybody needs to look at the other ones. I know sometimes rail is looked at independently, and the utilities sometimes don't get brought in till too late. And so that's what I'm looking at. Hopefully they are stakeholders that are considered no matter what type of facility you're planning, because it could, we can go back to rail terminology, derail the project if you've got something else that's going there.
Thank you. Hi. Number one, thank you very much, this panel. I appreciate it. I'm E.T. Mitchell from Craven County. I will confess I am a transplant from Northern Virginia. I spent a lot of time on 95. I've also lived in Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and Mississippi. Two comments in terms of evacuation planning. Every state does storm evacuation very differently, and that needs to be included in the plans. It's not just which lanes of a road you open up. Is it governor mandated? Is it area mandated? Is it county by county mandated? And I think it's a lot more complex than we are aware of, and we have to address it now with changing weather patterns. The second thing is I would like to encourage specific solutions both for the urban and the rural divide, and also for the age of the populations. Okay, a Northern Virginia or a triangle, 35-ish demographics, is going to embrace changes in technology much faster than a retirement community where at 60, I'm young. Okay, you're not going to make a heavily retirement demographic happily dependent on new technology unless you have some very specific strategies to address those divides. So not just urban and rural, but also younger and older. And I think for any of these plans and technology changes to happen in the future, we really need specific solutions and guidance, and sometimes pilot programs to try it and see what works and what didn't before we deploy it, or anybody deploys it on a big scale. So thanks.
I'll just chime in on some. Thank you for those comments, and I could not agree more on the need to have better coordination of evacuation plans. And sometimes some of the most simple things you can do that the coalition tries to step in and do is gather everyone's evacuation plans and send them to each other. So I think that's a role that we always try to play. Again, going back to Kate being the sister of the Wright brothers, like how can we just insert ourselves and just facilitate that kind of exchange? But it did not mean to oversimplify the challenge because it is extremely challenging. And I really appreciate your comment about age and as far as demographics and how as we're going through incredible change in our transportation system, how does that affect different populations? And I think we make a big note about age because Congress wants to do a national mileage-based usage fee pilot, which is very concerning because there's a lot of barriers that I think we need to figure out how to address first. And I think the pilot programs that we're doing is giving us information about what are real challenges and what are ways to overcome them. So thank you for your comments.
Sure, I think particularly when we're looking at our demographics, I mean, we're going to have 500,000 older residents in the next few years, and how you're looking at mobility and how people are getting around in the rural areas, and sooner or later rural people need to come to the urban area too, so they need to be connected. But how they use our transportation network is different, and so we can send out electronic surveys and they might not fill them out. So, again, going back to that stakeholder feedback is that, we're in transportation every day. We're working through normal transportation issues. We're trying to get feedback, but again, when the plan is done, we need to continue to go out, talk to other groups, talk with potential stakeholders. I think the feedback process is just never complete, and we do need to look for opportunities to try new things. I mean, when we were talking about the Transportation 2020 plan, I know we're on 2050 now, but when we were talking about 2020, flip phones were the thing. And so look at how much technology has changed and how it's impacting our industry, it's impacting our citizens, impacting how we deliver transportation services. And so, again, that feedback process is just never done, and I think it's a continuous quest to look for new stakeholders to bring in and to get input so we can be responsive.
One thing that is more clear to me, and I've been on the board now for going on 3 years, we're all, in some way or another, we all are part of transportation. What concerns me is the general public out there, the average citizen. Things are moving much faster than folks want to believe they are. And I was real interested in the general session this morning. Autonomous vehicles are going to happen in our lifetimes, most of us' lifetimes. And most folks in the regular citizenry, I just don't think understand that, how close it really is. So, and there's a couple schools of thought on the older population, and it's interesting, and we'll see, younger folks, my kids grew up with cell phones, so it's second nature to them. I don't think they fear any of that. But the other thing about the older population, we're probably more hesitant about giving cars up, but then at some point, when you can't drive, that autonomous vehicle may be a great solution. So there's a couple different schools of thought, I guess, on that, and it'll be interesting to see as we go forward how that plays out.
Good afternoon. I'm John Auble from TomTom. I had a question about fairness. Trish, you brought it up. So in general, the quick question is, in the world of MBUFs, which I'm a huge fan of, but when it comes down to that fairness thing, one is everybody to a certain extent has some choice where they decide to put themselves on the map so they have access to transportation or not. We can't all influence it how we want to, but we have some influence about where we are today. If you change the rules, then you kind of pull out the carpet out from under everybody and says, well, I'm here for a reason. Now you just changed my cost structure. As you look at these national studies, how does fairness play into that? How are we measuring that or trying to do exploration around that?
So one of the main ways that we are looking at answering fairness is through survey questions. So to expand a little bit on what I meant by fairness and see if this gets to an answer. So we asked folks, do you think it is fair that an EV owner is using the roads and not paying for the maintenance of those roads? Everyone says, oh gosh, that's not fair. Definitely not fair. And then we say, do you think it's fair to charge an EV owner who has made a conscious choice to pick a vehicle that doesn't use fuel, to have less carbon footprint, etc.? We're going to now charge them more. Oh gosh, that's not fair at all. So what I mean by fairness is complicated is you can't have it both. You can't do both ways. Either the EV owners are going to pay more or they're not. So fairness is very much in the eye of the beholder. So we have to be careful when we say fairness. And then we also have to be careful when people's gut reaction to what fair is. So that gets back to, I think you were going on, what's people's relationship to transportation? How do they choose to engage in the transportation system? What kind of vehicle do they drive? Where do they live? What options do they have? And so this may change some of that decision making. But I would argue that it is putting a blind or a hidden decision and putting a spotlight on it. Because everyone is paying now, EVs to a little bit to a less degree. So I think we're going to have first the challenge of educating people about making them stop and say, transportation is actually valuable. You actually need it. This is its value. We think it's important. And then say, oh, did you know you're actually paying for it? And we're not paying enough. And then we have to say we're going to change. So I think that's my challenge that I think this concept faces, is that's a lot of education to pull people along. And fairness is going to be just intertwined in there regardless. So did I get to your question? Okay. All right, thank you.
Anyone else?
If you can hear me. I have a question for Emily. I'm Will Allen. I'm on the board of trustees at Go Triangle, the local transit authority. Thank you. You may have said so and I missed it, but the purchase of the S-Line into Ridgeway, North Carolina, is any of that dependent upon North Carolina's acquisition of the rest of the S-Line?
Right now, we don't have all the details figured out. I don't foresee that, but we're still working through the details right now. But I don't foresee that. And
thank you.
You're welcome. And I wanted to make a quick point as we're talking about fairness. We're talking about multimodal transportation and also costs. I meant to point something out in my talk before that I forgot about. When we talk about partnerships and planning beyond boundaries, in Virginia, we think about multimodal. We think about, so in some of our funding programs are actually mode agnostic in a way. We look at person throughput, freight throughput, rather than actual vehicle throughput. We're evolving toward that with some of our programs, including Smart Scale. And one number that we were looking at as we looked at the Long Bridge and some other improvements in that Richmond to Washington, D.C. corridor is that to build another lane in each direction on 95 between Richmond and Washington, D.C., we're estimating that would cost $12.5 billion. And so when you compare that to another mode and the upfront costs of improving another mode, this $3.7 million that we're talking about to acquire property within that same region so that we can run trains separate from freight trains seems like a smaller price to pay for person throughput. So just want to make a little plug for rail there, just a little one.
Thank you. Good point. And I might add that those of us in transit think that the 1.8 billion estimate for commuter rail from Garner to Durham is a bargain compared to what it would cost to add another lane to I-40.
Anyone else? Well, again, Trish, Emily, Robert, thank each of you again for your comments, your presentations, for your insight. It would undoubtedly